and I'll go through a little bit of a few items up front just to get us kicked off. Basic agenda for the webinar. I'll do a quick presentation or a quick kickoff. Then we'll have a presentation by Chris Smith from MnDOT and also Iris Caldwell from the University of Illinois Chicago Energy Resources Center. And they're actually the folks who administer the Monarch agreement that we're going to be learning about today. And then we'll have time after the presentations for a Q&A facilitated by Carol Andrews from St. Louis County. She'll keep an eye on the chat window, so probably best if we, with a group of this size, if we try to get our questions out through the chat. Although if you can't do that or don't want to, obviously you can pipe up too, and we'll try to do it that way. As far as the meeting itself, thanks Jody for getting everything set up here so we could get everybody up to speed. The goal of the webinar today is to get out introductory information about what we're calling the Monarch Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances, or CCAA for short. And so this isn't an end-all be-all. This is try to give everybody a basic understanding of what the program is, why it was created, how it works, hopefully answer some of the common county questions that are out there. We've tried to anticipate some of those by getting together with a smaller group prior to this meeting. So hopefully we'll be able to answer at least some of the basic questions out there. Really, we want to try to focus on two things. One is giving you enough information ultimately to see if your county should enroll in this program. And again, just going over some of that baseline information. And then in the future, potentially doing another one of these once we have more detailed information. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. MCEA has formed a Monarch subcommittee to dig into more details and report back to the bigger group. We'd like to put together something that either like on a cost benefit basis or similar basis that we can individually as counties make decisions on whether or not we should enroll in this process, and also be able to go back to our boards, explain it, and help the board make a decision on whether or not to enroll. So that's a goal. The other goal is to hopefully create a template process to, if you do decide to enroll, how that process would roll out, how you would take advantage of certain things that maybe you're already doing on your road and bridge network that could apply to this process. So really two goals. The subcommittee so far is the member counties are St. Louis County, Stearns, Olmsted, Crow Wing, Carver, Chisago, and then we also have MnDOT representation on the subcommittee. We really appreciate the time that Chris, who is a MnDOT employee, and MnDOT is under no obligation to necessarily help out the local units of government in this case, but they are doing a lot of work actually to help us out here. So thank you to Chris and also to Iris for working with us on this and putting together this information for us. With that being said, we don't want to also shoot the messengers here. I've had a chance to learn about this process, and as a county engineer, we always look at something like this that comes out of the blue, and okay, here's another environmental hurdle or issue that we're going to have to deal with. And so I've already got over my anger issues on this, and so as you go through the steps in this process, today, I don't want you to take out your anger issues on the folks doing the presentation. You can save that for after the meeting. But it is, we greatly appreciate these two individuals coming forward and helping us out in the ways that they are. Like I said, at the end of the presentations. We'll try to do a Q&A. Hopefully, we will answer a lot of your questions through the presentation. So please wait till after the presentation for those questions to come out. Jody is also recording this meeting, just FYI, and it will be put out there for our organization, for MCA, to take advantage of after this meeting is done as well. Let's see if I've missed anything else here. I think I've covered it all. So I guess with that, I'd turn it over to Chris and Iris for the presentation.
Great, thank you, Jim. So again, my name is Chris Smith. I work in MnDOT's Office of Environmental Stewardship, and I'm the agency's wildlife ecologist. And I know I interact with many of you on your state aid projects that have federal highway dollars for the endangered species consultation process. Just a bit more kind of quick background. So I got really involved in the Monarch CCAA early on, kind of in an effort to kind of look out for MnDOT's interests and trying to build in some flexibility and predictability into our operations in the future. And I think that there's that same potential for the counties as well, which is why we're here kind of presenting this. Just real quick, Iris, do you want to introduce yourself before I kind of jump into the main part of the presentation?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. So my name is Iris Caldwell. I am the program manager at the Energy Resources Center at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And we have been facilitating the development of the CCAA for the past 2.5 years as part of some broader work that we do with the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group, which is an industry organization that really brings a variety of transportation and energy sector and other partners together to talk through and work through concerns and opportunities to create habitat on energy and transportation lands. And it was really through the concern around the Monarch butterfly listing decision and regulatory certainty issues and so forth that the CCAA came to be. So we've been very excited to support this process through the development of the CCAA. We also took on the role as the program administrator, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that actually means. But happy to be here again to help present information about the CCAA and help answer questions.
Great, thank you, Iris. And just to double check, everybody can see the screen, at least if you're in front of a computer, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yep.
So just want to start off with just a little bit of background. And so as you see here, we're kind of run through some Monarch butterfly basics, just so that everybody's kind of on a level playing field as far as what they know about the species. We'll cover the listing decision, the really kind of broad overview of the CCAA. We'll get into some of the details, including the enrollment process. I'll provide the MnDOT example, so what we've done and how we have done it, and I can share those materials with the group afterwards. I think that'll be a good starting place for those counties that are interested in signing on, or at least that consideration. And then I'm hopeful that we'll have quite a bit of time for some discussion, Q&A, to address any questions or concerns that we did not hit on in the main part of the presentation. And Iris and I will kind of trade off. I'm going to start with the first few slides and then hand it over, and then I'll wrap it up with that MnDOT example, and then we'll work together on the Q&A.
And Chris, it looks like you might have lost your screen sharing. Or at least I'm not seeing it.
Let me. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, let me know if you lose it again as I try to move through the slides. Still see it?
Yep, sure can.
Okay. Yeah, just let me know if it disappears. I don't know what happened there. So, as you're probably already aware, but if not, the Monarch butterfly was proposed or petitioned. Let me get the language right. It was petitioned for federal listing, and it's under review currently. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. Monarchs, so they're caterpillars. That's what you're seeing here on the right. This is the first stage of the monarch caterpillar. They only feed on milkweed. And in Minnesota, we have quite a few species of milkweed, some of which are actually quite rare. But the most common species is common milkweed, which occurs in quite a lot of our roadsides. And then swamp milkweed is also fairly common. And then in some of the other parts, western Minnesota, southern Minnesota, there are a few more species that can be fairly abundant in roadsides as well. But that's important to keep in the back of your mind, that the larvae, the caterpillars, only feed on milkweed. Adults, on the other hand, will forage, they'll nectar, they'll sip the nectar out of a whole variety of flowers, including some noxious weeds. And so even the fairly low quality roadside habitat often still has some of these noxious weeds or other flowering resources that might attract this species. The monarchs that spend the summer in Minnesota, they all migrate south and they all go to Mexico. There is a western population, but they do not occur here in Minnesota. Typically, depending on where you are in Minnesota, but typically they start to arrive in southern Minnesota in early to mid-May. Obviously, that fluctuates a bit depending on what the spring's like for us. They occur statewide in Minnesota by midsummer, early to midsummer. They have multiple generations over the summer. And so unlike a lot of insects that stay put, this species has a couple generations, usually one generation as it actually migrates north. And then once it gets to the northern part of its range, which Minnesota is part of, it has several more generations. And then that last generation migrates back south to Mexico. Eggs are typically laid on milkweed. Occasionally they're laid near milkweed. And then the butterflies, once the caterpillar's old enough and large enough, it actually leaves the milkweed, typically goes to grass, shrubs. Artificial structures are actually really popular: fences, decks, other sorts of features on the landscape that have overhangs, and they form a chrysalis. That's what's pictured here. And then that's, they spend a little bit of time in that chrysalis, and then they transform into that butterfly and fly away. The adults that emerge in Minnesota in August and September, so right around now, fly south. And so any adults that you see right now are going to be done with egg laying, and occasionally you might see some lay eggs, but those eggs probably aren't going to make it. But the adults are starting to fly south. We're already seeing that. We've had some cool weather already. And so typically by the end of September, give or take, the majority of the adults are gone, or at least well on their way. There are often some stragglers into October and November. Depending on what the weather does, those individuals might not make it to Mexico. And really they're not individuals that we're typically worried about. We're typically worried about the bulk of the population, which is typically gone by then. And so let's see here. So there was a listing. Originally, the listing decision was scheduled to be made in June of 20. Was it 2019, Iris? I can't even remember. But it got pushed back until December, and the primary reason is they wanted to give some more time for conservation activities, and then collect another year of overwintering data for both the eastern and western population. But now the listing decision is anticipated in December of this year, so December 15th, 2020, and that is court mandated. I won't read the whole slide for you. I will mention real quick that the Federal Endangered Species Act is really used and kind of as an emergency room for species that are in decline. And so species that are declining and occur across a large geographic area, which the monarch does, where one or a few states really can't do things all on their own. A species may get listed to have some more federal support and guidance across the whole range. And then another way that it's used, although it's not so much the issue here with monarchs, is just if the non-federal natural resource agencies out there, fail to conserve populations, the feds can step in and help prevent, extinction long term. And while today we are certainly focused on the CCAA, that is focused on transportation and energy rights of way, the folks out there who are concerned about monarchs really are taking what's kind of been dubbed the all hands on deck approach. And so, there are folks engaged with agriculture, there's folks engaged with state, departments of natural resources, and many of those state DNRs have developed plans and things not so dissimilar from what we've done with the CCAA. There are folks focused on urban, residential habitat, and everything in between. And so it's not just transportation that's being singled out here. And the citation, this paper was published by Thog-Martin et al. In 2017, and it actually kind of quantifies what all the different kind of sectors can potentially contribute to monarch conservation. And no surprise, probably to most of us, road rights of way were identified as an area where there's room or there's opportunity to help the species. So I think with that, I'll cover this here too real quick. So there's a few things that can happen in December with that listing decision. And so Fish and Wildlife can decide to list the species as threatened or endangered. They can decide that listing isn't warranted at the moment, but it's and precluded, so it doesn't get listed. Or they can decide that listing is warranted, but it is precluded by other higher priorities. And if the last example, the species then becomes a candidate species, and some of you may remember from years past when we had candidate species in Minnesota, that still candidate species are primarily a concern for federal undertakings. So there still would be some regulatory oversight if that was the decision that was made. The CCAA can bring, if the species is actually listed, it brings some regulatory assurance and predictability. It provides incidental take coverage so we can have a fairly seamless transition from a time when the species isn't listed to when it is listed. And we'll go into many more details about that. If it's decided that listing isn't needed, it is quite likely that there'll be some legal challenges. Kind of regardless, if it is listed, there will likely be legal challenges, and if it's not listed, there's likely to be legal challenges. And so participating in the CCAA, even if the decision is not to list come December, still provides some assurances in case the courts get involved and decide to list it that way. And we've seen that happen in Minnesota with wolves, where Fish and Wildlife has delisted the wolf and courts have relisted the wolf several times. And that can often happen rather rapidly, so there may not be time to sign on to something. And so there's still kind of that assurance insurance that's provided by participating despite a decision like that. And then, this consistency, this predictability is really important. Again, so if the species ends up being a candidate for a number of years, we're going to know up front what our expectations are and be able to work and do what we need to do relatively easily. And so, one of the questions that we've gotten, and I suspect will come up in this group, is kind of, well, what would happen if the species does get listed? And so far, Fish and Wildlife has really focused on impacts to milkweed in our region. And because milkweed is so abundant in our roadsides, even where we don't plant it, any activity that we were doing out on the landscape that could impact milkweed, could cause problems if you weren't participating in an agreement like this. And so mowing, for example, there are other regulatory processes that would have to be followed in order to be allowed to mow. And if you were to wait until listing took effect, that can be a lengthy process. So there might be many months, if not years, where you're unable to mow legally. Construction that impacts roadside vegetation would be impacted. And it's important to keep in mind that the Federal Endangered Species Act in many cases applies to any activity regardless of funding. And so it's not just federal activities that would be impacted. In this case, because milkweed and monarchs are relatively common on the Minnesota landscape, you would be hard pressed to have a project that wouldn't rise to the level of needing to go through some significant consultation with Fish and Wildlife. And the non-federal process for consulting with Fish and Wildlife is actually much more onerous than the federal process. And then I know something that Carol had asked about, and I think everybody in this group is probably pretty familiar with what happened with the northern long-eared bat. And the northern long-eared bat was the first species with a statewide range in Minnesota to be listed in a long time. And we saw significant impacts to projects as well as maintenance activities, given some of the tree clearing restrictions, timing restrictions that were put in place after that listing. And the northern long-eared bat's actually not a very common bat on the Minnesota landscape. And so, one of the things that I had mentioned to, my leadership in the agency is that, the monarch listing would impact the way we do business much more than the bat did. And for most folks, the bat was a significant, challenge to deal with. And so that was really the main reason that MnDOT took the steps we did to get involved with the creation of this agreement, is because we knew without something like this, we would be in a world of hurt if the monarch gets listed. And we can certainly come back to that and discuss more details later on. And with that, I think I'll hand it over to Iris.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So, then this concept of the CCAA comes along. I was getting a little bit of an echo, but okay, we're good. And for those of you who aren't familiar, CCAA stands for Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances. And this is a voluntary pre-listing tool that the Fish and Wildlife Service has available. It's in a suite of conservation mechanisms. But this particular tool, the CCAA, is essentially a cooperative agreement. Again, it's voluntary. It occurs prior to the official listing decision between non-federal partners and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And it essentially provides an incentive for those non-federal partners to do proactive, immediate conservation for that species of concern prior to, or make those commitments prior to an official listing decision. And in exchange for that, in exchange for doing those proactive steps up front, the organization gets regulatory assurances that no additional restrictions or requirements or mandates will be put upon them if the species becomes listed. So it's really this give and take win-win scenario for everyone involved, including the species, to create this incentive and then at the same time provide that regulatory assurance back to the industry partners. You can go to the next slide. So the CCAA that we've developed for the Monarch is the first nationwide agreement of its type. So it was really unique and has created a lot of interest across the country. The reason we took the approach to go nationwide is much like Chris mentioned about the monarch being prevalent across the Minnesota landscape. We find the monarch really from coast to coast. And so the potential listing of the monarch butterfly could have, again, pretty significant impacts on operations from a variety of different types of industries and landowners. But again, we've been focused on the energy and transportation stakeholders specifically. The agreement itself aims to create more than 2 million acres of monarch habitat across the country. And in doing so provides that immediate benefit for the monarch, as well as a long-term habitat commitment, which is also important as we think about the future conservation strategy for the butterfly. As I mentioned, it provides that regulatory assurance and that regulatory certainty that an entity enrolling in the agreement, you know exactly what you need to do and where and how you'll be implementing conservation measures. And then you know what allowances you'll have through those assurances. And so it provides you that certainty, but also then the operational flexibility in terms of how we've structured the agreement. And I'll dive into some of those details on later slides, that you then have the flexibility to pick and choose where you're going to do conservation and how, and where it makes the most sense on your system in a way that you might not have under kind of a traditional regulatory set of circumstances. The agreement also is heavily based in integrated vegetation management practices and other really, sustainable vegetation management practices that are increasingly being used across the landscape. So we've really tried to root the conservation measures that organizations are agreeing to into activities that you might already be doing in terms of thinking about rotational mowing, using targeted herbicides, those sorts of practices. And then finally, the agreement creates, again, this really valuable public-private partnership, not only between the Fish and Wildlife Service and state agencies like departments of transportation, but also utility companies, railroads, and other potential partners. This slide illustrates the variety of partners that we had involved in the development of the CCAA. We really had a mix of state departments of transportation and utility companies all across the US. So literally from Maine to Arizona. Minnesota DOT, again, was a really instrumental partner throughout the development of the CCAA and really helped, again, shape, how would the CCAA function? What are the requirements? What are the monitoring requirements? And is that going to, again, be feasible for industry to be able to implement? Okay, next slide. So building on some of the work that, or conversation that Chris opened with, I think it is helpful to think about what could happen in the absence of a CCAA. So again, without these commitments, it's quite possible that the Monarch could be more likely to be listed. We know that the organizations that have committed to the CCAA so far have basically committed to create more than 250,000 acres of habitat. And that habitat commitment is being used by the service in their listing decision. If we also don't have the CCAA, there's an increased reliance on those agencies to have to rely on the requirements of the Endangered Species Act to provide that protection to the monarch butterfly through the more traditional means. There would be potential restrictions to vegetation management activities, like Chris said, potential delays to comply with those requirements. And then, of course, there's a variety of other tools out there, many of which could be more costly potentially, such as habitat conservation plans. And as Chris said, the CCAA really provides what we like to consider an insurance policy against the uncertainty of a potential listing, challenges that might take place, and then potential changes in the future. So we really focus on the fact that, again, this is a voluntary agreement and it's a fairly low risk agreement to participate in. So now I'm going to dive into some of the specifics in terms of how this agreement actually works. So who can enroll in the CCAA? As I said before, the eligible applicants are non-federal organizations, so either public or private, that manage lands associated with energy or transportation infrastructure. So this could be the rights of way. In the case of the utility sector, it could be generation facilities, distribution systems, and so forth. So those organizations that enroll into the CCAA, we call our partners. And so on the diagram on the right, you can see we have 3 partners listed there across the bottom. We have an advisory committee made up of a sample of those partners, representatives of those partners that work with the University of Illinois Chicago, which is the program administrator for the agreement, to basically manage the program, ensure that we're meeting our requirements, that the partners have the tools and resources they need to be able to implement the agreement and so forth. And then it's the University of Illinois Chicago that essentially holds the permit that the Fish and Wildlife Service has issued for the CCAA agreement. So we're the permit holder, and then we extend the coverage of the permit to all of the partners through what we call certificates of inclusion. Next slide. So here we have a little bit of an illustration to help, again, depict the different aspects of some of the key terminology we use in the CCAA. So an organization can choose to enroll your entire system of managed lands or a portion of them. Whichever you choose, that set of acres that you're enrolling, we call your enrolled lands. And those enrolled lands essentially is where you want to have your incidental take coverage for the Monarch, if the Monarch is listed. And you will be conducting essentially everything from your routine vegetation management activities or maintenance activities down to your conservation measures. And the land specifically where you're implementing conservation measures, we refer to as the adopted acres. So you can see those in green. And the adopted acres, again, are where you're going to be implementing a suite of those conservation measures. On a sampling of your adopted acres, you'll be required to do some effectiveness monitoring. It's really, again, fairly minimal, straightforward monitoring requirements, but you will do some annual monitoring to basically check and see, are you seeing the type of habitat response that you might expect based on those conservation measures you're implementing. Okay, next slide. So here we have the suite of conservation measures, which again, you can pick and choose across your system or on your adopted acres based on maybe existing practices that you've already implemented or what seems to make the most sense for your operations. This can include planting either milkweed or nectar plants that can support monarch butterfly habitat. Can include planning the timing of your activities, so looking at the timing of mowing to maybe avoid peak periods when the monarchs might be present. Herbicide use to potentially minimize impacts of herbicides, particularly broadcast herbicides. Where possible, avoiding some of those activities, so reducing mowing, moving away from a broadcast herbicide type treatment to more of a targeted herbicide treatment. Those avoidance types activities also would qualify as conservation measures. Looking at alternative management practices like grazing or prescribed burning or other types of vegetation management that really promote the type of beneficial vegetation and diverse nectar plants that we're looking for. Those would qualify. And then simply, there's kind of the set aside, so almost the do nothing approach, that if you just simply let your roadside be, and if you have a certain set of activities that have maybe in the past promoted that diversity of nectar plants, then simply just letting it sit there and not doing any sort of active management might be exactly what's needed to really promote those habitat resources. So that suite of conservation measures is really what we're looking at when we're talking about what happens on the adopted acres. Next slide. A common question we get, of course, is how much conservation is required. So we have in the CCAA specified minimum thresholds for the percentage of adopted acres you have to have on that enrolled system or that enrolled lands. For state highways, interstates, that percentage is 8. For local or county roads, that percentage is 5. And again, this is the minimum percent adoption that we would expect across your enrolled lands. You would be doing some sort of conservation measure. And of course, you can go above and beyond this percentage. We hope for that through the course of the agreement. But in order to enroll in the agreement, you have to commit to manage at least that percentage of your land through some sort of conservation measure. Okay, next slide. I mentioned monitoring. So again, effectiveness monitoring is required on a set of locations across your adopted acres to really, again, evaluate, are we seeing the benefits that we would hope to see? And in the table here we have on the slide, you can see that the number of samples you have to take in a given year is dependent on your overall adopted acres. So if you have fewer than 1,000 adopted acres on your system, and again, the adopted acres would be a percentage of your total enrolled lands, then you'd be required to do 10 monitoring points each year. Between 1,000 and 10,000, it'd be 30 points and so forth, you can see in the table. These points would be, monitoring points would be randomly distributed across your system. And you're primarily looking for two things when you do the monitoring. One is the presence of milkweed, and the second is nectar plant resources, or the percent cover of nectar plants across your system. Now, for the purposes of monitoring, and if there's questions on this, we can get into the details here, but really the primary required metric here in the upper Midwest is the milkweed presence. And it simply can be a matter of just going out onto the site, your randomly selected site, and checking the box yes or no if you see 6 or more milkweed plants on your 1,500 square foot plot. And then doing that on your additional monitoring sites. We do encourage organizations to collect a little bit more data than just yes and no, you see milkweed. So we encourage you to, again, look at those nectar plants, as well as, if possible, collect actual counts of how much milkweed. Is it 20 stems, 50 stems, so forth on your plot. But that gives us a good indicator of, again, the habitat quality that we're seeing and the effectiveness of those measures on the adopted acres. Next slide. So there are a couple of additional laws that have to be accounted for in terms of your overall compliance with the CCAA. As part of being an enrolled partner and having the coverage by the CCAA, you have to also commit to avoid take of any other federally listed species, and also to specifically identify avoidance and minimization measures for other listed plants or critical habitats that overlap where there may be monarch habitat on your system. There are some also requirements through Section 106, the National Historic Preservation Act, that really only applies to activities that are reasonably likely to result in take of monarchs. And there's a protocol that we've identified in the CCAA that would guide you through any additional processes associated with Section 106. Okay, next slide. So in terms of the enrollment timeline, we are in what we consider the pre-decision enrollment period right now. The CCAA was finalized back in April of this year. We had an early enrollment period where we were really trying to, again, get organizations enrolled in the agreement to help inform the listing decision later this year. That early enrollment period has ended back in May, and we're now continuing to accept applications from partners, certainly through the listing decision expected December 15th. But even after that listing decision, there'll be a period of time, depending on what that listing decision is, that we consider the post-decision enrollment period. And so when we think about, again, how long would you have to potentially enroll in an agreement like this? If you recall, back to the beginning of my presentation, when I mentioned that this is a pre-listing agreement, one of the important conditions of the CCAA is that we can only accept applicants or partners into the program prior to an official effective listing date, if that is applicable. So let's say, the scenario that the Fish and Wildlife Service determines that the monarch is warranted for listing and makes that proposed rule in December of this year. We would then expect that the final rule would probably occur sometime in December of 2021, possibly before, but likely December 2021. And an effective listing date would be about 30 days after that. And so this post-decision enrollment period would essentially mean that an applicant could enroll up until that effective listing date, say, January 2022, in the example that I gave. However, excuse me, there's a number of, sorry, just a second. Okay, thank you. There's a number of benefits to enrolling sooner than that. Obviously, the conservation benefits for the monarch butterfly, the immediate regulatory certainty that you'd obtain by being enrolled in the agreement, avoiding potential gaps in ESA coverage. Again, if there's challenges to the listing decision or the service decides to move more quickly in finalizing a proposed rule. Obviously, the benefits to being an industry leader and the recognition of being involved in helping to support monarch butterflies, as well as just generally building momentum around habitat conservation across the country. And then also just really providing an opportunity to ensure the success of this really unique and important conservation partnership that we've created. It's also worth noting that there's no time commitment or penalty for leaving the CCAA early. So again, there's very little downside to enrolling in the CCAA, and again, without any restriction if you would choose to unenroll or withdraw in the future. Okay, next slide. So we have received a number of applications since the CCAA was finalized, including Minnesota DOT's application. Minnesota DOT joins 7 other state departments of transportation and 9 energy companies that have submitted their applications to enroll in the CCAA. As I mentioned, those commitments from those 17 applications total us to just over 272,000 habitat acres across the U.S. So far. And if we look at the total commitments, not just those minimum adopted acres, but the total commitments from those 17 applications so far, we're actually upwards of more than 600,000 acres of habitat. So already we're having a pretty substantial benefit in terms of creating habitat for monarchs. Our goal is to achieve 465,000 adopted acres, and that would represent roughly 30% of the target that the all hands on deck paper that Chris mentioned had cited for the energy and transportation sector in the Midwest. So we're still focused on getting to that goal as far as, again, our minimum adopted acres. Next slide. To give you a bit of a sense of the enrollment process, if you're interested in learning more about the CCAA or having some preliminary discussions with us, we encourage you to reach out, certainly to myself or anyone here at our UIC team. Also to take some steps to initially look at assessing your system, what portion or all of your system would you consider enrolling, the types of conservation measures that you would like to consider selecting as part of your application. And then we have a formal, or I'd say maybe semi-formal pre-application meeting step, which is essentially just sitting down, although virtually in these current circumstances, with the UIC team to talk through, again, your application and some of the key factors related to your enrollment. Then you submit your application to us. The application itself is a fairly straightforward 5-ish page form with some supporting documentation. I think Chris will walk through his here shortly. But you submit that application form to us. We review it. The university team, as the program administrator, reviews the application. We share a portion of that application with the Fish and Wildlife Service, who conducts some checks that they need to related to Section 7 requirements. And then once you've gone through both of those reviews with UIC and the Fish and Wildlife Service, then we issue that certificate of inclusion, which again is the extension of the regulatory assurances and the incidental take coverage from kind of the umbrella permit to you as the individual applicant. We also have an administrative fee that you would pay. And then really that's the start of then implementing the conservation measures, the monitoring activities, and then the annual reporting activities. Okay, next slide. In terms of the costs, there is, as I said, an administrative fee. This is both an initial fee as well as an ongoing annual fee. And built into that administrative fee is a one-time application fee that you would pay in the first year. Then there's an annual base fee, as well as the primary factor that determines your annual fee is the number of acres that you are in fact enrolling in the system or in the agreement, and even more specifically, the number of adopted acres or habitat acres that you are committing to implement conservation measures on. There's a number of options to receive some discounts. Those range from if you exceed your adopted acres target, you can get a discount on your annual fee. If you implement some additional supplementary measures, maybe do some additional monitoring, that can also result in discounts to your fee. The typical ranges that we're seeing for the fees are between $5,000 and $15,000. For some of the really, really large systems, the fee can be upwards of $30,000 a year. But particularly as we're looking at smaller systems, those are more in that $5,000 or $5,000 to $10,000 per year fee range. Okay, so where do you get more information? We have here our website address up at the top, and if you go to our website, you'll see this picture. You'll see we have a dedicated page to the Monarch CCAA where you can get some specific information about the agreement. We also have a portion of our website called Working Group Access. You can create a free login, and from that login screen, you can access what we call our CCAA toolkit. And that toolkit has a variety of resources. The application is there. We have templates, we have case studies, we have video tutorials, a variety of different resources that can all be accessed from that toolkit. And if you go to the next slide, I think I actually have a screenshot. Excuse me, this is a screenshot from the toolkit. And recently, backed by some requests from some of our industry partners, we put together a suite of video tutorials that really walk through step by step the process of enrolling in the CCAA. So we have one video that's dedicated just to completing the application form. That goes section by section through the application form and describes, the type of information that we're looking for there. So encourage you to check out the video tutorials as well as the other resources that we have in the toolkit.
Great, thanks, Iris. I think the next few slides are for me. And if we can, we'll just hold questions because I suspect I'll get a few answers out in the next few slides here, but these shouldn't take too long to go through. So yeah, as Iris mentioned, MnDOT did submit our application back in April. And what we decided to do is to enroll all of our land, so our entire system, and I'll talk a little bit more about why that is here in a moment. And then one of the other things that you can decide is, well, what activities do you want coverage for? And the CCAA is kind of broadly divided into two different kinds of activities. And so one of which is referred to as modernization, or our construction type projects along existing highways and things. And then the other one's maintenance. And actually we decided to not include maintenance at this time. And again, I'll touch on why that is here in a moment. But I will acknowledge that actually that the maintenance and operations side of things is where the majority of the benefit actually lies with this agreement. And so while it may seem a bit counterintuitive, we have some reasons for that, and I'll discuss here in a moment. And so at this point, one of the things that we're doing in MnDOT is kind of developing an implementation team. And so there is, once you sign on and get approved, you got to kind of really, put the rubber to the road, to use a transportation pun, and figure out how you're going to get all this stuff done. It's actually, like Iris mentioned, the risk, the reward is quite large, and the risk through, fees and things is relatively small. But as a big organization like MnDOT, And as some of you, I know some of the counties have pretty large operations as well. It takes time and communication and teamwork to change, and change doesn't occur overnight. And the CCAA allows for that kind of phasing in to full compliance. And so that's kind of the step we're at now, is we've started to make some changes, and we need to figure out how we're going to, kind of memorialize some of these changes into the future to make sure we reach full compliance. We also just recently wrapped up our 2020 monitoring, which I'll come back to here in a moment as well. And so, real quick, what is suitable habitat for the monarch? And again, this, kind of where you draw the line on suitable habitat is a little bit, has to do with kind of your risk tolerance. And so, like I mentioned, we enrolled everything, including our paved surfaces. And the kind of two reasons we did that is, one, it really simplifies the accounting, the tracking, for us going into the future. So we just know everything is enrolled. We don't need to worry when we have a project or we're doing maintenance. Well, is that maintenance occurring on 3 acres of enrolled land and 2 acres of non-enrolled land? And so we have that aspect of things. The other reason we decided to enroll everything is we do have, on some of our really large projects that span, 2 or 3 construction seasons, large stockpiles of soil that may occur in an area that had previously been a paved surface. Now it's all ripped up and there's exposed soil, and milkweed and flowers and things could colonize those areas during construction. And so, again, just to kind of simplify things on our end, we wanted to make sure everything was covered to account for all those different situations. I think this is, kind of, well, milkweed grows everywhere aspect here in Minnesota. This is kind of where there is, there's some flexibility here. So certainly we do see milkweed growing out of sidewalk cracks. And here it's hard to see. There's a little bit of a milkweed growing out of the abutment of a bridge in between the little rubber gland that's meant to keep, moisture out of that, that joint that's below there. But really, in the grand scheme of things, that's pretty low risk. That doesn't happen very often. Same thing with gravel and dirt roads, depending on how often they're maintained or how much traffic they get. On the upper right here, this is common milkweed growing out of a rural road in northwest Minnesota. Again, fairly low risk. The stockpiles that I mentioned. Wetlands that have vegetation growing along the edges. So we do have one species of milkweed in Minnesota that really does like those wet areas. It's called swamp milkweed. And so, emergent wetlands I wouldn't exclude, but I'll talk a little bit about what's not habitat in a second, and open water is not habitat. For the most part, dense forests are probably not habitat, but if a tree falls or there's a blowdown, certainly we see those areas colonized by milkweed and other resources, and then edges as well. So we do have a couple milkweed species that are somewhat tolerant to shade, and so they may grow into the edge of a forest some. But things like, open deep water, that's not habitat. So if you have right-of-way that, goes out into a lake, you certainly could exclude the lake. There's really very little risk to you there. You certainly can exclude the impervious surface. I know there's been some comments in the sidebar here about that. So you wouldn't have to include the paved surface. And so that's an option to keep in mind. It just complicates your tracking a bit. And then areas with very dense forests, it's, again, very unlikely that there's going to be milkweed or other flowering resources that would attract monarchs into those areas. But just know that if the area is logged or there's a wildfire or a blowdown, that something that maybe hadn't been habitat could become habitat. And so one of the biggest hurdles for MnDOT and many of the other DOTs that have kind of gone down this path is just figuring out how much land you have. And I'm not sure, kind of where counties are with that. I don't know if you have your right-of-way figured out or not, but We kind of early on took a couple different approaches, and I'll start with the second approach first here. So one of the things that I had done is just taken a bunch of measurements of interstates, U.S. highways, and state highways to kind of figure out average right-of-way widths. And then in discussions with our Office of Land Management, I became aware of this report that we are required to submit annually called the Government Accounting Standards Board report. GASB 34, I think, is the kind of lingo that they use. And it used a similar approach like 2 decades ago to estimate right away, and then since has actually taken parcel by parcel level accounting of our right of way. And so because that's kind of our official right of way estimates, we decided to use that report as the basis of our land holdings. And you can see, so the GASB report is the yellow highlighted acreage, and then the kind of random point measurements that I did is the non-highlighted acreage, and they come out to be fairly close. And in the grand scheme of things, when you look at the percent of adopted acres needed, it's a very small difference, and so we decided to move forward in that way. You do, I suspect, you're mostly all engineers, so very simple math for you. You can calculate your lane miles, multiply your lane miles by your average width, and come up with your numbers that way. And with the goal, though, so MnDOT is working quite hard, but it's a long process to actually digitize and geospatially have our information geospatially available, so where we could query it in GIS. And so Iris kind of briefly touched on some of the reporting that goes into the CCAA, and you're allowed to kind of add and subtract acreage and update numbers in that reporting process. And so we do anticipate our acreage numbers to improve over time as we get further along in the digitization of all of our land holding information. But at this point, we didn't have it ready to go, and so we're using this as an estimate, and that's fine within the CCA. It allows for that. You just have to explain kind of how you arrived at your estimates. And so, going through that process, we enrolled our full system, which is estimated to be about 256,000 acres at that 8% adoption rate. That's about 20,500 acres that we have to do follow those conservation measures on. It could be that deferred mowing or some of the other ones. And then and I know this is going to be a question and an issue for many of you on the phone, because we have a lot of mowing and haying by third parties that is kind of beyond our control. We looked for areas where we had more control and could hopefully reliably achieve those conservation measures. And interstates, kind of rise to the top for us because we know we have a fair amount of control over what goes on in the interstates. The majority of them are fenced, and they're policed a little bit better than some of our more rural, smaller highways. And looking at the acreages on our interstates, we have around 43,000 acres total. About 17,000 acres of those is actually the paved surface, and so we're not doing conservation on the paved surface, but that still leaves us in excess of 26,000 acres of green space where we could do conservation work. As we take a deeper dive and look at some of this, it's likely some of those numbers will be reduced, in areas where we have frequent mowing, where our roadsides are maintained as turf grass. And then I know our maintenance folks actually expressed some interest in identifying non-interstates where they felt, we could contribute to monarch conservation and have less risk of, third-party, use of roadsides that would run, counter to what we're required to do. And so that's something that the implementation team is going to be taking a closer look at is, can we identify some non-interstate highways where we can do some of this work? And there's a lot of reasons for for thinking along those lines, but I'll spare you those details at the moment. A couple more quick points, and Iris touched on the Endangered Species Act and the National Historic or Cultural Historic or whatever Preservation Act. I don't know the name of that one off the top of my head. The Section 106 stuff. So by enrolling in this agreement, enrolling lands, you do create a federal nexus, although it's a fairly weak federal nexus. But just know that you do have to comply with those other federal regulations. And that for us was the primary reason why we did not opt to include our maintenance activities at the beginning, is because making sure that our maintenance activities are complying with Section 106 especially was a slightly bigger challenge according to our cultural resource folks than I think maybe Fish and Wildlife originally anticipated. And so we basically have just decided to not include maintenance at this time, and with the sole reason of just giving ourselves more time through that implementation process to ensure that we have a solid way of ensuring compliance. And so I have no doubt that we can get there. We just didn't think we had time. And also to get our application in that early enrollment period. So we were kind of running up against that deadline. And so the discussions we've had internally, probably the easiest way to meet the acreage requirements for your adopted acres is to defer some of the mowing that we do. And this specifically is the full width mowing. And so it's not your safety mowing like you see in this picture. It's not your sight corners and that sort of stuff. That's generally, those are not areas that we're overly concerned about monarchs using. But it's everything, more or less from the ditch bottom to the end of the edge of the right of way. And so, it'd be delaying that mowing until probably for most counties and for MnDOT, it'll be done after September 30th. But if you didn't want to mow it in the fall, you do have a spring window, depending on what our spring is like, to do some mowing. I know some of our areas, we do some full width mowing in the fall for blowing snow control, and this would still allow us to get out there and do that. And then just like I mentioned, we're still working through some of those internal processes to ensure compliance with those other federal regulations. And I'll run through our application in a little bit more detail to highlight, especially the endangered species one. And then just to wrap this up. So I mentioned we did a bunch of our monitoring already for 2020, and we didn't really get into it in Iris's slide. At the very bare minimum, you just have to check a box, yes or no, you have 6 or more stems of milkweed present. But there are optional ways of monitoring that I think for most of us will probably actually be really important to do. And so under the CCAA, if we were just to say yes or no, 6 or more stems, only 56% of our plots met that, which would trigger some discussions with UIC and Fish and Wildlife about, well, what can we do to make sure more of our plots have a sufficient amount of milkweed. But we also happen to actually count the actual number of stems. And when you look at that information, you see that the average number per plot is 36 stems. You see there's a lot of variation, anywhere from 0 to over 400 stems per plot. And then by collecting the actual count information, we're able to calculate the 90% confidence interval for the amount of milkweed on our roadsides. And of most importance is the lower interval. And so, we're 90% confident that on average, our roadsides have 19 stems of milkweed, per plot. And because that 19 number is higher than that 6 number, we're still considered, compliant and in good standing with the goals of the CCAA. And so that's been really important. I don't know, Iris, if you had anything you wanted to chime in on that or not.
No, I think that's helpful to hear your experience. Again, I think we're hoping to have that additional data from across the country, especially in this first year or two of implementation, really to help us again think about those monitoring thresholds going forward. That might be something that we revisit with the Fish and Wildlife Service, particularly again if we're seeing a lot of instances like what we've seen in Minnesota, where again the milkweed is really clumpy. Where it occurs, it tends to occur in high numbers, but then it might not be on another randomly selected site at all. So that's something I think we're continuing to evaluate, but it's helpful to have the more specific data, to help shape those conversations.
Sure, great. And so that really kind of wraps up the bulk of the presentation. And I was going to pull up, and I can pull up, the fee calculator, our Section 7 materials, some of the Section 106 guidance, and then our full application and kind of scroll through it. I don't think it probably makes sense to go through any of these things in a lot of detail just with our time. I suspect there's going to be, additional questions and discussions. And so, Carol and others, do we maybe want to just pause for some Q&A discussion now? And if questions and comments lead us to these things, we can kind of look through them. Otherwise, these are things that can be sent out later as well.
Sure, Chris, let's do that because we've had a couple things show up in the chat as questions that I think tied to some things that you said real recently. So sure. I'll start repeating some of those. You did address the question about including paved area. I think some of the most recent questions have to do, and this is one I have as well, is do the conservation practices need to be improvements or changes to current practices, or can a county get credit for things you already do? For example, if we don't mow the full width or use only herbicide as spot spraying, not broadcast, is it possible to get credit for those things, or does it have to be changes?
Yeah, so it's my understanding that you can get credit if you've already, kind of implemented practices, but I'd want to double check with Iris that that's her understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way we really structured the agreement was recognizing that there's a lot of habitat out there already. And frankly, in some of the conversations we were having with industry partners, this is not what we want to see happen at all, but we had some of our industry partners saying, hey, if the Monarch gets listed, we're going to start actively managing some of our rights of way in a way to really minimize the presence of milkweed, which is exactly the opposite of what you would hope might happen in terms of helping to actually benefit the Monarch. And so when we designed the agreement and the requirements and the conservation measures, we fully recognize that a lot of these activities, if it's rotational mowing or mowing just a portion of your right of way, doing spot herbicide treatments as opposed to broadcast herbicide, these are industry best practices, and they're things that we want to continue to promote. And so if you're already doing that substantially across your system, you're in a really good position to be able to enroll in the agreement and really not have to change much. And I think that's been certainly the case in Minnesota. I know Texas DOT is really relying on the work that they've been doing through their vegetation management programs over the last 15 to 20 years in being able to meet the requirements of the CCAA. So that's perfectly fine and also anticipated.
That's good news. I'm going to read 2 or 3 sentences right out of the CCAA on page 16 that to me was an aha as to why this makes sense for transportation agencies, but I think also supports the idea that existing practices should be counted. And it says, vegetation within the majority of energy and transportation land is generally managed to prevent the growth of trees and other large woody vegetation. So if you go back to what Chris said, you don't usually, dense forests don't provide good habitat, but cut areas do. This results in land that is in a perpetual state of arrested early successional habitat. And I'm going to skip ahead. And those habitats are in decline due to changes in land use, etc. so that such that transportation lands present an incredible opportunity to provide valuable wildlife habitat by maintaining those early successional communities. So am I correct, Iris and Chris? And that, does that relate to what you were just saying, that that's why transportation lands can help, and why it makes sense that what we're already doing now to maintain clear zones and to maintain vegetation to prevent erosion and all that might be good enough in some cases.
Exactly.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep. And I see a comment about the mowing law on the side, and I think we can kind of tie these two things together. And so, yeah, so I think a lot of folks will already be doing things that kind of get you the credit, and it'll be relatively easy to comply. One of the things that we do see occurring, and I know Fish and Wildlife has identified as an issue here in Minnesota, is the timing of our mowing. And I know a lot of us out there are mowing primarily, full width, if we're doing it at all, in the month of August because of what the mowing law says. But the mowing law does actually have several exemptions. And I know the comment mentions for safety, but there's another exemption for prairie vegetation management. And while it's not, I think, a perfect fit for the CCAA, I think, we can make a very compelling argument that, by changing some of our mowing practices for the purposes of managing this early successional grassland prairie habitat for the monarch, we are still in compliance with the mowing law. That also said, the last several legislative sessions, there has been desire to update our mowing law, and MnDOT watches that very closely, as I'm sure many counties do as well. And we would like to see the language changed if we get to that point, that kind of more clearly identifies, deviations from any timing restrictions for the purposes of, endangered species management, conservation purposes. But that said, talking with, our attorneys at MnDOT and others, we feel the current exemptions do allow us to change the timing as needed for this purpose.
Thanks, Chris. Another question that was posted earlier, and I know we heard, has to do with rural ditches that are farmers use them for haying. I'm reading two things at once here. So let's go to that question of if your easement, and this was something somebody had posted before the webinar, is if most of your easements are, the property owner is a farmer and that's their land, they're farming it. How does that work?
Yeah, and so the way the CCAA is set up, and Iris, jump in if I get anything wrong here, it kind of very loosely defines kind of, and I'm using air quotes here, owner. And so, you don't have to own the land and fee, but you do have to have an easement or some permit or some mechanism that gives you some control over the vegetation management on that land. Now, if, let's say, the county DOT has vegetation management allowances in the easement language, but the private property owner does as well, you might consider enrolling that land, but it may not be the best place to do your adopted acreage work because you're going to be running, into a conflict with that private landowner. Now, if the county has full rights to the vegetation management and the adjacent landowner does not, then that kind of becomes, an enforcement issue, which is the main reason why we've stayed away from our non-interstates, because that's where we feel like we can really enforce that, folks can't go out there and hay it. That said, you're not going to be held if you enroll the land and some third party comes in there and hays it without your permission. You're not going to be held liable for that. It would be at that point between Fish and Wildlife and that person who did that mowing or haying in that case. Does that kind of make sense?
It works for me. Another question that I know had come up during your meeting a week or two back was why can't we use parks or other public lands in the gross acres and then use those to meet the 5% minimum area for the adopted acres?
Yeah, I don't know, Iris, do you want to take this one, or you want me to?
Sure. Yeah. And feel free to jump into Chris if you have anything specific to add. But I think primarily it comes down to what Chris was just saying about needing to have the authority to manage the vegetation on the lands that you're enrolling. So I guess if there was a circumstance where for some reason your agency was responsible for managing vegetation with an associated, well, certainly like rest areas or other associated facilities that might not be specifically roadsides, that are, again, somehow affiliated with your transportation system, those can certainly be included. And any, pollinator plantings or any other, special measures that you might take on that landscape that are in line with the conservation measures menu that I went through, those would certainly count. There are, again, some distinctions between, and you heard us say on several occasions, energy and transportation lands or lands associated with energy and transportation systems. That is intentional. We, during the public comment period for the CCAA, received a lot of interest, as you might imagine, from organizations outside of the energy and transportation sector who really wanted to be able to enroll themselves in this CCAA. They see the benefit, and that ranged from individual farmer landowners to large chemical companies or other large landholders. And so, again, given all of the work and assumptions that were built into the calculations and the policy work that was done to develop the CCAA, we really had to, again, put some bounds on, again, the types of applicants and the types of work and activities that they would typically be doing on those lands and could get, again, the incidental take coverage for. And so that's why, again, you'll see those multiple references to energy or transportation lands and related lands, again, to help us kind of put those bumpers or sidelines on the scope of the agreement. But as I said, again, if there's for some reason lands beyond your roadsides that you have the management authority and are doing vegetation management activities, more than likely those could probably be included in your enrolled or adopted acres. And Chris, if there's something maybe I'm not thinking through there that you might want to add in, feel free to do so.
Yeah, I mean, I think the take home is that the lands need to have some sort of transportation purpose. I think, there's a little bit of wiggle room there. I know we've discussed gravel pits, and as long as the gravel pit is primarily being used for a transportation purpose and it's owned or some other, managed, by the county, that probably would be fair game. But yeah, a county park or a county forest or something that is really has no transportation connection, that's a hard sell.
I will make note that we can start kind of keeping a list of things that the MCEA Monarch subgroup should have as agenda items. And I'm going to put that one on there because it's come up frequently. And I think we need to go through what Iris and you just provided as information, Chris, and know that we're going to need to probably put something into writing that helps provide guidance on which areas can and cannot be used for the adopted acres, or look for the existing information to provide more details to people on that. I do want to go way back up in the meeting chat. The first question from Guy, are there any programs to give milkweed seeds to highway departments? Guys, I would be more than happy to spread them while doing turf disturbing projects, mix in with existing seed mixes. And I've had the same idea as to whether or not if we take whatever seed mix we're using and add not just milkweed, but add more forbs to it, to those seed mixes. Is that likely to, I've thought about that, but I wasn't sure that it would add up to enough acres, a couple 100 square feet at the end of each culvert here and there. Doesn't add up to a lot. Now and then we do a bigger project where you definitely are seeding a couple acres. Any thoughts on that, Iris or Chris?
Yeah, I guess I'll chime in just real quick. Certainly, just looking at the size of the MnDOT system and how many acres we need, we don't do anywhere near enough seeding on an annual basis to meet those requirements. And so the deferring the mowing till later in the season is really kind of the easiest way of meeting those requirements. Now, that said, we do seed a lot of natives, and as part of that implementation planning process, we do hope to revamp our seeding manual to some degree, to try to find some additional opportunities to get both milkweed and those nectar resources into more places. Folks on the call may be familiar. So actually LRRB and MnDOT recently joint funded a project looking at roadside vegetation seeding and its effectiveness. And so kind of as that project moves forward, it's going to go back and look at a bunch of areas that were seeded in the past with natives and non-natives and compare what's actually there to see if we can't try to identify like a good, relatively low cost seed mix that actually works, so we're not wasting resources. We know that a lot of plants, despite us seeding them out there in the roadsides, just aren't going to thrive there. But there are a lot of native things that do really well in roadsides. But that'll be kind of part of that discussion. And so certainly seeding native species is good, but it's probably not going to be the only way, the only thing. You have to do more than that to get your acreage, I think.
If you live in a part of the state, you had said to me once, Chris, that north of Duluth, Monarch appears to be, that the presence of milkweed does appear to become a limiting factor.
Yeah, thanks for that one, Carol. So a few folks, including myself, have done some kind of survey, inspection work up in northeast Minnesota. And yeah, you get north of Duluth and milkweed becomes less of a weed, it seems. And there are at least 2 species that are historically known from northeast Minnesota. And so that is an area where I think seeding milkweed itself is probably worthwhile. And I know we have a few projects coming up where we're using modified seed mix that includes some more milkweed. In a lot of the state, so western Minnesota and southern Minnesota, probably 3/4 of the state or 2/3 of the state, milkweed is in no short supply. There's actually been some research done out of the university that shows it doesn't really matter if you seed milkweed because it's going to show up anyways. And so while we still do include milkweed in some of our seed mixes, it's, seeding out in those areas, milkweed anyways, is not really a focus because there's plenty of milkweed out there. It's just a matter of not mowing it at the wrong time of year that results in a lot of take of caterpillars. That's where there's the conflict. But in northeast Minnesota, milkweed is not super common. And where you do find it, it often is inundated with monarch caterpillars. And so there is that evidence that milkweed in northeast Minnesota might be a limiting resource.
All right, thanks. I have to say, I was kind of crack up at the way that biologists use the term take for shred. Shredding caterpillars. Anyway, there is a number of comments that relate to the fee. It's sort of 2 different things. Some concerns about the fee and justifying it to boards and things like that. And then sort of a related comment about whether or not counties could, I think, the idea of working together, pooling resources to both for a number of benefits, including reducing the enrollment fee costs for everybody. So I wonder if you guys could talk a little bit more about what's behind the fees, what they get used for, things like that.
Sure. Yeah, I can start. And Chris, if you have anything to add, feel free to jump in. So we do have a document that's on the CCAA toolkit that I mentioned that goes into a lot more detail. It's at least 2-page document that talks about how the fee is calculated, how the fees will be used as part of the program administration. So I think that's a good reference for those of you who are, again, particularly preparing for these discussions with your board or other decision makers. But generally, again, the fee is to support the university in administering the agreement. So that includes, overseeing the issuance of the certificates of inclusion, the annual monitoring and reporting on an annual basis. We have to take all of the partners' monitoring reports and compliance reports and compile those into one comprehensive report that's submitted to the Fish and Wildlife Service. Any sort of coordination that needs to be done throughout the year between partners, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the the advisory committee, basically, again, to ensure that the program is running smoothly. Again, if we're running into implementation issues, we're there to respond to those types of concerns. So the university really serves as that intermediary between the Fish and Wildlife Service and the partners, and in doing so, is envisioned to really streamline the process, both for the service and those partners, in terms of, dialogues or questions or other reviews that is, I'm sure you have experienced, sometimes can really get backlogged at kind of the federal government level. So that's, again, the role of the administrator and kind of the purpose of the fees. As I said, there's a document in the toolkit, and we can certainly share separately, that goes into a lot more detail and could be a good reference for those who have questions. Regarding the questions around kind of pooling resources, that is something that we had envisioned as well when we were developing the agreement and the overall fee structure. And I had meant to mention something in passing when I talked about the fee. So thank you all for raising that question, which gives me an opportunity to talk about it now. But we do have what we call the consortium option, which is discussed in the agreement. I believe we have some additional supporting documentation about consortiums, which I can dig up and provide separately as well. But really, the concept of the consortium is much like what you all were describing in your comments, that it's essentially a number of typically smaller organizations that are pooling together basically to submit a joint application. And with that joint application, then they would intend to coordinate on monitoring, the reporting activities, and if they're in essence able to kind of work as almost a single entity, from our perspective, in terms of submitting all of their information jointly and coordinating amongst themselves, then they can pay essentially as a single entity. And so that is a much more cost-effective approach to take. And we've certainly seen particularly like smaller rural electric cooperatives that have really jumped on board with this idea of submitting a consortium application, and would encourage you all to look at that option if that makes sense. There are a couple of special considerations. So again, I'd encourage you to look at the what's spelled out in the CCAA agreement itself. You do have to identify kind of the single entity that will serve as kind of the administrative oversight. And there needs to be, again, some sort of mechanism that ensures that, again, these partners are coming together and working together, and that single entity has some recognized oversight ability to be able to serve in that role. But beyond that, I mean, it is intended to be a flexible option for particularly smaller organizations to use to really, again, make participation in the agreement a lot more cost effective.
Yeah, so I just want to jump in and kind of take this kind of question from another angle, because I see several comments and questions about fees. I don't know if folks can see the screen or how well they can see it. Depends on probably how big your screen is. MnDOT's fee calculation, and you run through, your number of adopted acres, your number of acres you anticipate actually contributing. And if you go above and beyond that, you get a little bit of a discount. Iris did mention that there are some other things you can do that can result in some discount. And so when we run all those numbers, we end up with something on the order of, $11,000 to, $9,000 per year. And you can see it fluctuates a little bit. There was some early incentives for early enrollment that are no longer available. And so you have to take that with a bit of grain of salt. Longer term, we'll probably be looking around somewhere around $10,000 to $11,000 a year. But if we were to think about these costs, they're relatively small costs compared to the cost associated with dealing with a Monarch listing and not being part of this agreement. And so if an entity is not at all part of the CCAA agreement and the Monarch gets listed and things like impacts to milkweed and flowers becomes regulated activity, you would have to go through that habitat conservation planning process. And that takes, like I said, on the short end of things, it takes many months, 6 to 12 months. But in reality, it more often is 2 to 3 years and probably costs, upwards of $100,000 between staff time and having a consultant and maybe even quite a bit more than that. And so relative to those costs, this is actually quite a deal. The same thing with, delays to construction. And I know a few of you have mentioned, I think Carol, you were one that mentioned, changing contracts that have already been let to deal with winter tree clearing for the bat. Well, mid-year, this species gets listed, and now you have to go and do a bunch of change orders to meet those new requirements that are being imposed. That I can guarantee you is going to cost you a whole lot more than this agreement, these administrative fees cost you. And so when kind of thinking and along those lines, myself and leadership within MnDOT, we view this as, a very affordable insurance policy against those much more costly repercussions if we weren't participated and the species does get listed.
Thanks for addressing the fees. Stephen has a question that I hear a lot. Wouldn't there be less loss due to car hits, cars impacting butterflies if the areas weren't along the roadway, which also seems to make areas like parks away from the road seem like a better habitat? And I know from reading the document, I think it states that there's studies and things that show that support the idea that if you do all these conservation measures, you'll increase the number of monarchs so much that the amount lost from vehicles, you still have a net benefit. Is that the right thought process?
Yep. Yeah. And so certainly, road mortality for some wildlife species is a big issue. Monarchs, again, there's multiple generations per year, and each individual female butterfly is laying hundreds of eggs. And so, yeah, the research that's been done, and it's an ongoing field of study, but the research that's been done shows that roadsides are a net producer of butterflies. And, certainly some are getting hit by cars and are getting, there's some impacts with salt. Salts in small quantities is good for butterflies, and a lot of, high quantities is not good for butterflies. But they're still net producers. The other thing is there's some interesting research that's just starting to come out looking at floral diversity in roadsides. And actually they show that there's lower road mortality on roadsides that have more floral resources. And while it hasn't really been tested, the kind of idea behind it is that they have to cross the road less often to meet their needs. And so that, makes some intuitive sense. And so that's another thing to keep in mind. And then, like I mentioned earlier, and Iris mentioned, there is this all hands on deck approach. And, land holding, parks and the feds and, agricultural industry, they're all, they're all looking at what they can do to help this species, and roadsides have been identified as, a piece of that larger puzzle. So that's kind of where we're at with that. So, Guy, your question about, why wouldn't we be exempt if we're a net producer? So Fish and Wildlife, when it lists a species, it can exempt certain types of activities. But that would be a risk, because we don't know what those exemptions might be until, the listing occurs. And, if roadsides aren't exempt, then, then you're stuck dealing with a potentially challenging regulatory environment.
All right, thanks. There's a couple things about that I know you answered in the chat box, but about rotating locations of mowing. So Corey says, can we move the location of the 5% habitat areas year to year so we can complete a mowing, brushing, spraying program across the system? And others point out, if you don't rotate, that's the purpose of rotating mowing, is to keep it from turning into all brush, and then you're not going to have the milkweed. So do you want to make sure everybody heard your answer on that that's posted here, Chris?
Yep. So absolutely, your adopted acres can be rotated for exactly that reason. Certainly, if we, deferred or just did away with mowing on certain areas, they would get really brushy, and eventually they'd become forests in a lot of parts of the state. And so, yeah, rotating them around is absolutely possible. From a brush standpoint, you can still do your brush work. It's just a matter of deferring it until a time of year when the monarchs aren't present. And so you could do it anytime during the winter months, anytime after the end of September. And so there may still be ways of controlling brush without having to rotate, but certainly rotating is acceptable and probably part of the process for a lot of folks.
All right, thanks. There's a couple other comments related to the consortium and questions that I'll come back to those if we have time, but otherwise I know for sure that's something that the subcommittee is going to dig into, and so we'll retain these questions and get back to people. And Chris has offered to be part of that subgroup as well. There was another one. Here's one. I'm going to go way up to the 30,000 foot level because engineers are not comfortable with the things if things aren't logical. So in parts of the state that are heavily wooded, you were saying before again that there's not milkweed and such in wooded areas. It's not good habitat for the monarch. So then when we put roads through there with nice wide and create the habitat, we're sort of artificially creating monarch habitat. So I think part of it is understanding, in those areas, did the monarch exist before, and it's just other land management activities have taken away other habitat, and so now we're kind of inserting ours in place of that, and it's still, we're not trying to have a habitat for a species that wouldn't be in that location otherwise. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I think so. So historically, monarchs would have occurred statewide. And like I mentioned, in those forested systems, there's still some habitat. There's wildfires. Historically, there were wildfires, there were grazing animals, blowdowns create pockets of habitat. So there would have been some habitat. It just would have been patchy, and it would have, been dynamic. It would move through time, as forests, mature and regenerate. And so, yeah, when we go through those areas and we put in roads, we, concentrate that habitat in these long linear strips, and then we maintain it in perpetuity so it never transitions back out of habitat. And so we essentially we're attracting these species, whether or not it's our intent, or at least it certainly isn't our main objective, but we have, just through the types of activities that we use to maintain these roadsides, created an attractive place for these species to concentrate. And so it's not like they weren't there naturally. It's just now we're concentrating them along our roadsides when, those, roads didn't exist.
All right, sounds good. I had a couple other questions. Chris, you said that the CCAA allows for phasing in of the changes needed to meet it. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And I know we also asked earlier, like if we can get our foot in the door with, a certain number of acres, maybe it's not our whole system, to get the coverage and then expand it later. So there's kind of two questions there. One is, so maybe do break those out. The idea that you don't have to enroll what in the end you might end up enrolling a larger area than what you start with to get your foot in the door. If you could talk about that, but then also this idea of phasing things in. And
Sure,
what you're showing
sure.
on the screen, I don't know if you can blow it up any bigger.
Yep. Is it too small?
I got my reading glasses on. I can't see. So close that little, there you go. That's better.
I have a very large screen at home, so I never know what it looks like for other people. But so yeah, the two parts of your question. So I'll take the phasing one first. So again, acknowledging that it's tough to change for those entities that do need to have perhaps significant change to the way they do business. It's tough to do that overnight. You can't just flip a switch and everybody does things differently. And so you could start, with and so I guess maybe it's easier just to show what we've done if folks can see the screen. But, we talked about implementing seasonal mowing restrictions on at least, 5,000 acres of our interstate. We've identified the development of this implementation plan, developing some internal guidance and monitoring as kind of what we committed to in year one. And then in year two, we increased the amount of that's seasonally restricted mowing that we're doing, looking at identifying other stretches of MnDOT highways that we can use as adopted acres. And then by year three, phase three, we would be fully compliant with what we have to do for the CCAA as far as the approximately 21,000 acres. That said, we'll likely get to those acres quicker than this phased approach illustrates, but we wanted to give ourselves flexibility in case, we ran into issues or, someone in one of our districts accidentally got a little bit mow happy and forgot they weren't supposed to do that kind of thing, because it happens. And so you could do something like that and kind of ramp up to compliance over the course of a few years. And then the other strategy that you mentioned is that you wouldn't have to enroll everything. And so if, the fees are problematic or the monitoring is problematic or, there's some other hurdle to enrolling everything that you envision enrolling, you could identify, a certain route or a subset of your county system that, logically makes sense and focus on that initially. And if the Monarch were to be listed or at some point in the future, you can amend your enrollment, your application, and go through that process and add additional lands. The issue with that route, and there's pluses and minuses to everything, is if the species were to get listed, you only have protection on those enrolled lands. And so at that point, you would need to, enroll those additional lands to get the protection and the assurances that the agreement provides, if that makes sense. But that's certainly a viable option. The other option, which is what we did at MnDOT, is that we focus solely on our kind of modernization and construction activities and left off the maintenance activities for the time being, again, because it kind of simplified some internal processes for us. But we fully anticipate, especially if the species gets listed, needing to amend our, application with UIC to get covered for those activities, because those are the ones that really need this protection the most, if that makes sense. So there's a few different ways you can kind of tailor it and amend things later. There are fees associated with amending your application. And so if the cost of things is, a barrier, paying some fees now and paying, fees again to amend it in a year, that's another thing you have to kind of factor into your decision.
Okay. Chris, I asked you yesterday how difficult it is to apply if it's something that people, would typically hire a specialist to help with, and you had a good, useful answer to that. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe even show that part of the toolkit or anything, or Iris?
Yeah, so I apologize. I got distracted by the chat window for a second, so I didn't hear the whole thing. So you want me to,
Yeah, I said, when I asked if we have to hire somebody, you said no. Really, the application, between the videos and the application, that the system can step you through it. You don't have to be a biologist to do it. That you found that what took the more time was internally determining things like, enrolled acres, adopted acres, and what conservation measures you're going to take, and then just getting buy-in on whether or not this voluntary agreement is something that the entity wants to do, or wait and take their chances.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Yeah, certainly the application process itself, hopefully is not a barrier for folks. Iris did mention the website that has a bunch of resources, and one of the resources it includes is the application template. And, so a lot of the application is pre-populated. You have to kind of just fill in the sections that are relevant to your organization. And so you can see, and what exactly it says doesn't matter for the purposes of today, but you can see the blue text is what I added and the black text is what's part of that template. And so it's really just, a paragraph here, a couple sentences there, a few, bullet points there, sort of thing. It's relatively easy to do. The bigger issue really is that coordination within your agency, that buy-in component, discussing risk, with your agency leadership, what level of risk tolerance does your organization have? If it's really low risk tolerance, then you're going to want to try to enroll everything and get as much coverage as possible. If you have really high risk tolerance, maybe you either don't enroll very much, or maybe you invest some time in preparing the materials, and Iris, plug your ears, and don't apply right now, and kind of give things a little bit more time. But there certainly is risk to doing that. If everybody does that, and at the very end, everybody's trying to rush to sign on, there's likely to be a bottleneck, and I suspect some people, probably won't make the cut. And so that's, an internal discussion. Calculating the acres, if you take that really rough estimate approach with some fixed right-of-way width, again, that's not all that difficult. And then, implementation, I think, is where you're spend more time, is just making sure, you're working with your operations folks and getting buy-in from them at various levels. And then, making sure that work is actually occurring. But the application is really quite simple. Probably one of the parts that took the most amount of time, and where a biologist is helpful, is the endangered species component of the application. But as MnDOT, as a statewide agency, we developed these conservation avoidance and minimization measures for every species and critical habitat in the whole state. And so as a county, you wouldn't have to address all these species. And assuming the things that we developed for MnDOT is acceptable to you, a lot of that stuff you could just copy and paste and use as your own. And certainly, depending on how much demand there is, I suspect I can get support from our state aid office to provide a little bit of assistance here. But again, a lot of this probably is something that you can just plug and play for the species that occur in your county. And really, you wouldn't have to do a lot of additional work. Now, if you saw something in these avoidance and minimization measures that were a no-go deal breaker, then you get into a situation where you'll have to propose things that are acceptable and then, work with Fish and Wildlife and UIC to, get a thumbs up or thumbs down on that sort of thing.
Hey, thanks, Chris. Well, we're getting towards 3 o'clock, so I think we're going to wrap it up with that, knowing everybody's got a lot to do. Before we, I'll let Jim wrap it up too, but I also wanted to point out that from a communication standpoint, the MCEA subcommittee and Jody and Jim and I would encourage the county engineers to funnel comments and questions to MCEA through the subcommittee, so through Jim and I or others listed on the subcommittee, and we can get the members list out by an email to follow up on this. Certainly we can't tell you can't contact Chris and Iris directly, but I think it's going to help this all fall together a little bit more effectively if we can hear people's comments and questions, discuss them, and like I said, Chris is going to be involved with that subcommittee. So I just feel like that's the most effective way to do that, is to funnel those things through us. So thank you again to Chris and Iris and for everybody for participating. Jim, do you want to have any closing words?
Yeah, well, you stole my thunder because I wanted to thank Chris and Iris, but just teasing. So yeah, thank you really sincerely to both Chris and Iris for taking time out to put this together and to spend this time with us. I guess the other thing is, as part of that post-meeting email, we want to include this presentation. That would be good. And then also maybe a copy of MnDOT's CCAA as well, just as I think of it as a pre-look at the template that we would be trying to put together as the MCEA subcommittee. So again, to dovetail with what Carol was saying, let's not come at this from 87 different directions here. Let's try to have the subcommittee put together. Well, first of all, do more work, investigate this a little more thoroughly, and try to come up with again a template that may work for most counties and that will also hopefully help everybody make a good decision on whether or not you would want to enter into this or whether a consortium is the way to go. We're going to look at all of those things, hopefully, in a fairly quick time frame, and be able to get answers out to folks. So that's the goal. Again, this was the first blush at getting this on everybody's radar, getting a baseline understanding of what we're dealing with, and now we need to kind of start delving into more of the details and hopefully answering more questions and coming up with something that everybody can use, so we all don't have to go through the learning curve.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for your time. I really appreciate it, and look forward to working with everybody as we move forward with this topic.
And
all right.
same.
Thanks,
Thank you for
everybody.
the time.
Thank
Have a
you.
good day. Bye.
Have a good
Bye.
rest of your day.